Assalamu alaikum. So I wanted to do a quick video on some recommended books on sex and intimacy in Islamic or Muslim history. People often ask me, because obviously with the books that I've written, especially with A Taste of Honey, they're interested in understanding the history of Muslims, especially Muslim scholars writing about sex and intimacy. And this is not a new tradition. So I just want to kind of talk a little bit about that, the history of Muslims speaking about sex, dating back to the ninth century when you had a number of Muslim scholars, um, primarily in Baghdad in Iraq, who wrote a number of sex manuals, and they were inspired by Greek medicine, Indian erotology, so books about Indian erotology from like the Kama Sutra and the likes, as well as Persian love poetry, and what a number of these Muslim scholars, such as Al-Jahid, who was a famous Afro-Arab scholar from Iraq in the ninth century, they collected a number of these translated works, and then they started writing their own sex manuals written from their own cultural and religious perspective. So they're predominantly Muslim. There are also some Arabs as well, Arab Christians who wrote some sex manuals. Initially, it started as writing about um, treating some sexual dysfunctions. So it initially started, so that the genre is known as ilm al-ba, meaning the art of sex or the study of sex, and it was mainly looking at how people, and they would make use of the expertise of the Greek physicians of their time of that they came across of their works, what they had to say about correcting some sexual dysfunctions and how to kind of help people who are struggling with impotence, also known as erectile dysfunction, um, vaginal dryness, all sorts of issues in relation to the body, in relation to sexuality. That's why a number of these scholars wrote these works. And then there were also some other scholars who wanted to write about sex and intimacy, but mainly from, you could say, from the tradition of Islam or from what the Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him, had said, as reported in certain hadiths, and what Allah has said in the Quran, as well as what scholars had said about certain verses in the Quran which had like sexual references or sexual euphemisms. So again, it started from the ninth century up until like the 18th, 17th century, but you had many scholars, like great prominent scholars such as Jalal ad-Din as-Suyuti, who was an Egyptian scholar, one of the greatest scholars of Islam. He wrote about so many different sciences. He wrote about, it's reported, over 23 books on erotology, on the science of ilm al-ba. And he was quite a pioneer in his field, because what he did, although there were many books that was written before him, hundreds of years before him, a lot of the books that are written by scholars, they spoke about things that from an Orthodox Islamic perspective wasn't considered to be, within the teachings of Islam. So some of the scholars, they wrote about homosexuality, they spoke about um, people having relations obviously outside of marriage and all sorts of things that Islamically is not permitted, but was prevalent in the Muslim societies in the medieval period. So what Asyuti he wanted to do, he didn't really want to touch on like non-Islamic, shall we say, practices. So he wanted to concentrate on writing about lawful relationships and how a man, primarily targeted at men, how men can ensure that their female partners are sexually satisfied, experience climax, reach orgasm, and what have you. So, and he made use of the knowledge of his predecessors, so scholars who were, like I said, who were writing about erotology, as well as some other traditionalists and hadith scholars who are writing about erotology, but more in the form of like marriage manuals. So he wanted to he wrote some books that were not only instruction manuals, but also somewhat, you can say, quite entertaining. So he'll use some anecdotes, he quoted verses of poetry in a number of his books of erotology. One of his most famous books on the topic was called Al-Wishafi Al-Wishafi Fawaid and Nikah. So translated as the sash on the benefits of intimacy. Now he used the word nikah, because nikah has, several meanings in Arabic. One meaning is like marriage or marital contract, but another meaning, original meaning of nikah, it means sexual intercourse or sexual relations. And so he was like a double entendre. He used nikah in his title to refer to not only like the benefits of sex, like for what nikah, also like the benefits of marriage. And he even mentioned in one of his books that the best book that's written on on nikah, one of the best books that's written about marriage and marital intimacy is a book that was written by a Moroccan scholar who traveled to Tunisia in the 14th century as well as to Libya. A scholar called Abu Muhammad Ibn Ahmed at-Tijani. So he was a scholar from the Hafsid Caliphate in northern Africa, in what was known as like Ifriqiya, which is like modern day like parts of Tunisia, and I think parts of Libya as well. And he was a scholar who wrote for one of the rulers. He wrote a manual called Tuhfat Uruz wa Nuzhatun Nufus, which is translated as the gift of the bride, like the pleasures of the soul. So he wrote this marriage sex manual, you can say, but it was mainly speaking about intimate relations for married couples as well as like how to choose a spouse and things like that. All mainly derived from the Quran and prophetic traditions from Ahadith. So Asyuti used a lot of when he wrote his book, compiled his work, the sash on the benefits of intimacy. He made use of a lot of what Atijani had mentioned, and he also made use of what another scholar called um, Ali bin Nasir al-Katib, which he wrote a book called Jawami al-Ladha. Jawami al-Ladha is a book translated called the Encyclopedia of Pleasure. And like I said, Asyuti, he mainly made use of those two books, Jawami al-Ladha and Jawami al-Ladha, the Encyclopedia of Pleasure, was a book that not only spoke about, marital relations, like halal relations, but he also spoke about, um, you could say, non-Islamic relations like lesbianism, homosexuality, because these were all things that was quite prevalent in like 10th century Muslim society in Iraq, pedestry and all sorts of stuff. But what Asyuti, he didn't want to talk about those things. He wanted to mainly talk about what is kind of like lawful relationships. So obviously from the Islamic perspective, lawful relationship either is within the confines of marriage or within the confines of concubinage. Whereas obviously a man having lawful concubines and he's allowed to obviously have intimate relations with them. So they're the two main books that, like I said, that Asyuti made use of. Jawami al-Ladha, which is called Encyclopedia of Pleasure, that was written around the 10th century, and the other book is Tuhfatul Urus, which is the gift of the bride, written by Tijani, a North African scholar from Morocco. And then, like I said, Asyuti made use of those two books in compiling his book. And what I wanted to do with my book, A Taste of Honey, is to highlight the rich tradition that many Muslim scholars have had to write about sex and intimacy, because again, it's not a new topic. Unfortunately, for many Muslims, it's quite a taboo topic, especially following colonization, where I would argue a number of Muslims adopted like a Victorian Christian understanding about sex, where sex was considered to be extremely taboo, dirty, it's only for procreational purposes, where male pleasure is prioritized over female pleasure. Whereas when you look at a lot of the classical Muslim scholars, their works being obviously inspired by hadith of the Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him, where he taught his companions and the scholars were teaching men to ensure that your wives are sexually satisfied for yourself. So they were more speaking about the importance of female pleasure, especially within the erotology tradition. In the fiqh tradition, you do have some scholars, some of the jurists who kind of place great emphasis on male pleasure and women ensuring that their husbands are sexually satisfied, whereas the erotology scholars, which as Suyuti, he was both an erotologist as well as a faqih, a jurist, they placed greater emphasis on making sure men understood the female anatomy, understood the female sexual response, and understood how to sexually satisfy their partner. So that's a bit of an overview. I'll go into more detail in my book, A Taste of Honey, Sexuality and Erotology in Islam. But I just wanted to give a quick overview of the history of the Islamic history of writing and speaking about sex. So again, that's just a little bit, like I said, a quick overview. If you want to know more, you can check out my book, A Taste of Honey, Sexuality and Erotology in Islam. It's quite a dense book. A more easier read is Lust and Grace, Sex and Eroticism in the Works of Muslim Scholars. So these two books. This is obviously definitely easy to read, very few pages. Case one's obviously much larger, but if you want to have a general overview or understanding about Muslim scholars writing about sex, you can check out those two books as well as this book, which I recently released a couple of years ago, Women of Desire, A Guide to Passionate Love and Sexual Compatibility. I'll give an overview about how Muslim scholars wrote about sex and especially concubines and things like that. So I think that will bring to a close. And again, if you want to know more, you can check out, I've got some online courses on erotologyinstitute.com. So erotologyinstitute.com if you want to know about the history of Islamic sexology, as well as some courses on how to sexually satisfy a woman and kunyaza, the tradition of helping women squirts and reach multiple orgasms, amongst other African traditions that I've got courses on. So yeah, that'll bring a close to today's brief chat.